All right, as I said before, thank you everyone who's taken a few minutes out of their day to attend today's webinar. We're going to get into getting started with KeyShot 7. My name is Will Gibbons, and I'm a trainer here, a KeyShot trainer at Luxion. And today I'll be taking you through today's webinar. A couple of things that some of you may be familiar with if you've attended our webinars in the past. This will be recorded and it will be made available on our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/KeyShot3D. And then we often get asked what computer this is being recorded on. So it's a 2013 Mac Pro. It's a 3 gigahertz 8-core processor. It's got 16 gigs of RAM. And if you have any questions during this webinar, go ahead and type them in to the GoToWebinar control panel. And we have a few other Luxion employees on the line, and they'll be able to answer your questions. And we will also have an open Q&A at the end of this as well. I'd also like to apologize in advance, as I got a little bit of a cold, so I'll try to keep the sniffles down to a minimum. During today's webinar, we are going to be covering a wide range of topics, and we're going to take a look at a lot of the new features inside KeyShot 7, and we're going to focus on things that are really going to make a difference for the user, that's you. Everything from small little enhancements to things that are now done differently in KeyShot 7. So we want to make sure that your migration is as smooth as possible. So we're going to begin with, again, a general overview, and then we're going to talk about organizing library resources. So this is everything from materials to backplates and things like that. There's also a video that was recently recorded a few days ago that I will be able to reference later as well. That is a full walkthrough of how to migrate your resources over. We're going to take a look at some of the new features and actually how to, the new material features, and look at how to make changes and adjustments to some of those new materials. And of course, our HDRI editor is now embedded in KeyShot 7, so we'll be talking about how to use that because it's a bit different. We're also going to talk about taking environments from a KeyShot 6 file and then how you can work with those in KeyShot 7. And of course, last but not least, we will be looking at studios and how studios can be used to improve the efficiency of your workflow and give you as much flexibility as you can, or as possible, while working through and with your models in KeyShot. So without further ado, we're going to dive into that. This is going to be primarily a demo style webinar. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over, jump right into KeyShot. And I've also just done a fresh installation of KeyShot 7 on this machine. So what we're looking at here is what you're going to see on your machine when you first open KeyShot 7. The first topic I want to talk about is the splash screen that you're seeing. This is your Welcome to KeyShot 7 menu, and I don't want to overlook it because we've added quite a few helpful resources to this rather than it just being a stagnant window that always shows you the same thing. The first item that we have here on the left-hand side, we see that there's two areas. By default, the learning is what you're going to see. And this is going to show our last webinar and or item that we've added to the YouTube channel. And then right below that, we've got our manual. And this will link right out to our online manual. So you can read up on new KeyShot 7 features or really anything that you want to learn how to do. When you toggle over to the what's new, you're also going to see news or noteworthy news items, latest blog posts, and the KeyShot 7 what's new guide. So again, we're trying to give you as many resources as possible to help you get up and running and comfortable with the latest version. And these are all hyperlinked out. So when you click on them, they will take you to the corresponding web page that will get you there. And then on the right-hand side, we have our demo scenes, which some of them may look familiar. And these are scenes that allow you to explore certain features within KeyShot and testing out how some items work. We also have the recent tab, but this has not been populated yet because we've not opened any scenes on this machine with this installation yet. So as you work, you'll see all your recent items will be in here too. Across the bottom, of course, if you do want to see a little bit more about what we're doing from a social media standpoint, if you want to connect with us and engage, ask questions, request features, things like that, that's your best bet by following any of these links to our social media. And again, if you want to really dive into KeyShot and learn as much as you can, the forum is going to be a great way to do that. And there's a button right here for that too. Our blog, we link out right to the blog. And last but not least, the buttons that you may be using every time, we have the open and import buttons. I think we have some background noise. All right. Sorry about the audio mishap. I think we're all good now. I keep getting muted. Are you guys able to hear me right now? No. All right. I think we've got that sorted. Yeah, so that's the first item of note is this new splash screen. So I definitely encourage you to explore it a little bit because again, especially on the left-hand side, the contents here is going to be rotating out and hopefully you will be able to see what we've added without having to go hunt it down on our website. That's the idea here. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually just go ahead and talk a little bit about our new KeyShot 7 user interface. And I'm not going to load a model quite yet. I'm going to just go ahead and work in this window right now. So a couple things. Your library and your project panel are not quite visible yet. So I'm going to hit M on the keyboard to bring up my materials and space bar to bring up my project panel. And the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and insert a cube. And I did that by hitting Control 1 or Command 1, depending on what your operating system is. You can also go to Edit, Add Geometry, and you'll notice we've added a number of other primitives that you'll find useful as well. And once we add that, you'll notice it's also automatically ready to be moved, which is nice because anytime you import a primitive, you're usually then going to move it. So it's quite a convenient feature. For now, I'm going to just hit the X, and we're going to just look around the new KeyShot user interface. So it looks quite familiar, but there are a few items that we want to bring up. We have, first and foremost, a drop-down menu, and from here on the top left-hand corner, you're going to see different workspaces as well as themes. And the workspaces are going to allow you to switch between different configurations of tools and windows that will help you depending on what task you're working on. So right now you see the default. If I switch over to animation, you'll see a lot of difference in here. We're going to have our geometry view handy. We get our animation timeline down at the bottom, and then we can manage all of our geometry over on the left-hand side in the project panel. If I go to advanced, we see a slightly different layout, and again, you will have time to explore these on your own and find out what works for you. But based on these, the reason and how we have these workspaces is because we have made the user interface completely flexible, and that is now customizable. So to go beyond that, what I could do if I decide that this top ribbon is a little too busy for me, I can right click anywhere outside of one of those icons and I can disable the text. And there, right away, I just have icons. And if you're familiar and you're experienced with KeyShot, maybe this is how you prefer to work. And furthermore, if you have a preference to eliminate some of these extra icons, if you don't use pan or dolly or tumble, which are items that you probably wouldn't use unless you're working on a laptop without a mouse, you can clean that up and get rid of those. So that's pretty cool. We can do the same by hiding text or changing the size of icons in different places. We can hide text or icons even in the tabbed workspaces as well. So that includes the library as well as the project panel as well. So I could hide those if I wanted to. So lots of flexibility, which is pretty cool. The other thing that we can do is we can tear a tab off and then isolate that tab to its own window. And again, this is how you can start building your own workspace by docking items. You can stack them. It's a really flexible workspace, and that's something that we wanted to focus on, was allowing the advanced users or people who have specific preferences to build their own workspace. And of course, for those of you who prefer a dark theme, we can switch that on the go anytime you'd like using that drop down. So pretty nice. Another thing that I'd like to mention outside of the flexible user interface is we have improved hotkeys substantially. So historically, if you hit the K key on your keyboard, you would get a list of keyboard shortcuts. Right now, if you do that, you'll notice not only are there quite a few more, but you have the option to click this button that says Setup in Details. When I click on this, this gets us into our preferences, and we can filter by looking for a certain action, such as move, and we can see that move part now has a hotkey. And of course, we could change that if we wanted to. We can change that down below. While I'm in here, I will also mention that we have hotkey presets. So for the camera control. So if you're used to working in another 3D application and you find yourself hitting a lot of hotkeys or mouse movements that just don't translate to KeyShot, you can do that now by changing how the camera defaults behave in KeyShot by choosing the program you primarily work in here, which is pretty nice. I'm going to go ahead and close this for now. Since we were talking about hotkeys, one thing that you saw in there is we have a hotkey for move. So I just wanted to share a couple of my favorites that really improve general workflow within KeyShot. So if I just hover over this cube, I don't have to click on it or anything. If I hit Control D or Command D, whatever is underneath my mouse is automatically selected and activated for move, which is really great. We also have another hotkey that I like a lot, which is hide. So especially if you have a lot of parts in your scene tree, you can hide an individual piece by hitting Alt and Control at the same time and left clicking, and that will hide that part just one at a time. So that's pretty great. And the other one I'll mention real quick before we move on is Control G. That actually adds a ground plane really quickly. So in the past, when you would go to Edit, Add Geometry, Add Ground Plane, you can do that with just one keyboard stroke, which is great. So that's a bit of an overview there, and I'm going to hop into our preferences real quick and mention just a few items as well that, let's say this is either the first time you're running KeyShot 7 or maybe even it's your first time in KeyShot at all. We can talk about a few preferences that you might want to change right from the start. I'm going to go ahead and switch this back to a light theme just to help out with the contrast, make it a little easier to see. Get back into preferences. And a few things here. Some people I know historically have asked me why your real-time view switches when you adjust or when you drag a backplate into it. If you don't want that to automatically happen, you can disable that with the Adjust Aspect Ratio to Backplate checkbox. Another thing that that is people generally like to know about is pausing the real-time render after a certain period of time. So if you don't want your computer to always be rendering, if you get up and walk away from it fairly regularly, it's nice that you can go ahead and hit this drop-down menu and just disable or tell it to stop rendering after a few seconds. Another thing is screenshots by default are going to be JPEG. If you switch that to PNG, you're going to get a higher quality image with just less compression. And this slider here is going to adjust that default compression as well. Another one I want to mention is save camera with each screenshot. If you don't want to start building up a large collection of cameras every time you take a screenshot, I would disable that. One other thing here, we have default startup scene. And before, where you could just change the environment that was used by default, this is very powerful because you can point it to a BIP file, which can contain everything from lighting to geometry. So you can go ahead and choose this if you want to start up with a similar studio setup every time. Just depends on what you want. And sometimes save reminders are handy as well, so those are there too. Those are a few of the ones I just wanted to mention though, and I'm going to go ahead and save those changes here. And let's get on with opening a KeyShot 6 file in KeyShot 7 so we can talk about how to work with those assets. And actually, one other thing before I get into that, I'm sorry for bouncing around a little bit, but one other thing in preferences that is actually worth bringing up, and it has to do with our assets. So if you go into your preferences in the folder section, this is telling you where KeyShot stores all of its library assets, everything from materials to colors to backplates and environments. And if you want to, you can actually change where KeyShot looks for all of those assets. There are sometimes issues or concerns when it comes to moving some of your custom assets from, say, KeyShot 6 to KeyShot 7 or an earlier version to a newer version. And one, again, I mentioned this earlier, there is a video that we can share or reference afterward. It was just uploaded to our YouTube channel a couple days ago that will get more in depth on how to do this. But one other way you can make this a lot easier for yourself is choosing a secondary location in which you save all of your custom assets. So in this example I'm going to show you, we will go ahead and look at textures. So if I go into my textures here, we can see this is the standard default library of textures. I'm actually going to point this KeyShot to another folder where I have some of my, say, favorite custom textures. So if I go to folders and I customize each folder and textures, if I hit this load folder button, I can now browse to add a second location. And when I do so, I'm just going to look on the desktop and I have a folder called My Textures. And I'm going to hit open, hit OK, hit OK. And I'm going to actually do the same thing for backplates as well. So if I go ahead and browse for that, it's in the same location, My Backplates. Okay. And this My Textures and My Backplates that I just added to the directory, those are not actually saved in the KeyShot directory, not in the default directory, and that's key. So I'm going to go ahead and restart now. I don't need to save the scene. And what we'll see is when we navigate to the textures, we'll go ahead and just change this to our defaults and then go to My Textures. What we'll see, maximize this a little bit. What we see now is this hard line with a shared folders, and then when I click My Textures, we now have access to the textures in that other location that I mentioned and referenced before. Same goes for backplates. You can see up above we'll have the default KeyShot 7 backplates, but then we have another folder where I've stored some of my own. And this is nice and easy because if you manage your assets and you keep them in a organized folder, you can just point, regardless of what version your KeyShot is on, you can just point to these as an external location, and that saves you the steps of having to migrate these from one version to the next. So I just wanted to share that. That'll probably make things easier for some of you guys. All right, so let's get to the meat of this. Let's open up a KeyShot 6 KSP using KeyShot 7. And let's talk about what you are going to run into when you do this. Because of some of the features that we updated and upgraded for KeyShot 7, some things are going to happen that I want to make sure you're aware of. So this is not new. We are asked if we want to copy our contents to a folder or keep them in a single folder. Well, I'm going to keep them in a single folder, and I'm going to just put them in my webinar folder for now. This is just basically preventing KeyShot from taking anything that was in this KSP and dumping them in the default KeyShot library. So let me go ahead and unlock these guys. There we go. So I've got my train, and a couple of things are going to happen as a result of bringing in something from KeyShot 6 to KeyShot 7. I'm going to go ahead and look at a few items here. And the first thing that we're going to do is double click on a texture that we have applied here. And what you're going to notice is that when I double click on this texture, or I'm sorry, this material, and I go look at its textures, we are using a image-based texture for the diffuse color as well as the bump channel. And inside here, you'll notice that when we look over to the right, we see texture, and we see the mode is set to texture map legacy. And what this means is that all of the options that we see down below here for mapping, this is going to look just as it did in KeyShot 6, and it will behave just as it did in KeyShot 6. Now, KeyShot 7, the texture mapping got a major upgrade when it comes to how textures are applied and handled. And if we want to take advantage of those new KeyShot 7 texture mapping features, we need to change this from legacy mode to just plain texture map. So you can either use this drop-down menu to change the type, or I can just click this button that says upgrade to new node. When I do that, nothing changes here as far as how that texture is applied. But then when I go look down below, we will notice that we have a few different options, and these menu options are going to look and behave as they do by default in KeyShot 7. The biggest difference is a center on model and a center on part mode. And this has to do with how this texture is being applied to this geometry and the basically the origin reference point. So that's something that you're going to want to be aware of. If you're coming in from, or if you're opening an older BIP or KSP from KeyShot 6 and KeyShot 7, and you do have textures applied, that's something you're going to want to do if you're going to need to make changes to that texture. Another example here is this procedural wood material I have here. When I double click on it, we go to the textures, and we will see that the center on mode is set to legacy. Now these are not image-based textures, these are procedural textures. So our interface here looks slightly different, but in this case, if we want to update to the new KeyShot 7 center on either model or part, we have to select those, and you will notice that the texture actually moves. That's because unless we are staying on legacy mode, there is no corresponding reference point for how this is mapped. So know that if you switch to either model or part using a procedural texture, you're then going to manually need to make some adjustments if you want it to be back in the same location that it was. So that's just something to be aware of. Last but not least, in another example here, if I double click on this same wooden part of the train and I go to my labels, we've applied a label. And this label is just an image-based texture. So if we go to our textures and we look at our labels, we can see that I have the KeyShot icon, and that's been applied here as a metal label. So when I go and look at the label properties, we have the same image-based texture for the color and the bump channel, and we see the same options as before, texture map legacy, and we see the button to upgrade to a new node. I'm going to open the material graph so you guys can actually see how this changes and what this means. I can go ahead and overlap that since the menus are basically the same, but if I double click on this texture that we are using, we see that it still shows texture map legacy. When I click upgrade to new node, we're going to see that this node is actually going to change to a KeyShot 7 style node. When I click that, you see it says KeyShot 6 icon, and then we have just a slightly different visual style here. The visual difference lets us know that this is now utilizing KeyShot 7 behavior, this texture, and down here we can see this other one is still on legacy mode, and by upgrading them, we can also go ahead and name them if we need to. So for instance, I can click up here and rename this one to, I don't know, label color, and then I can go down on this one. Oh, looks like I did it backwards there. I was still in the bump. So label bump, and then I can activate this other one and call it label color. So that's something else that we introduced in KeyShot 7 to help you organize your materials when working with them in KeyShot 7 in the material graph. So that's when working with textures and moving a file from KeyShot 6 over to KeyShot 7. Another thing that you need to be cautious of is going to be working with environments. That's your lighting essentially. That's a big deal. So if I go ahead and hit E on my keyboard, I will show my environment. And the environment we're using here is a default KeyShot 6 HDRI, but there have been a couple of pins added to it. So let's talk about those. I will throw this back on the solid color background just to make it easier to look at. But right here in our environment, we have two environments listed actually. We have the active environment, and then we have a studio style environment. So for KeyShot 7, we introduced an environment list, and this allows you to use and isolate or maybe create a collection of a few environments that you will use for lighting within this individual specific file. I'm going to go back to my environment here that has the extra pins. So what we want to do, let's say we want to pull these pins out so we can then make edits to them. Well, this is something that we can do in KeyShot 7. I'm going to move this guy over so we're not quite in full screen mode. And I'm going to go to my HDRI editor, and rather than launching a separate window like we did in KeyShot 6 to make edits in the editor, we can do them, we can make those edits from within the project panel here. So all you see here is the background. So KeyShot only recognizes this environment as a single image, but we still have the option to extract these pins, and this is what we're going to do. So this little button I'm hovering over here says extract pins from HDZ. When I click this, KeyShot's going to say, hey, well, we're going to pull these pins out of here for you, but where do you want us to put them? So I'm going to give it a location to do this to. So I'll extract them into my KeyShot 7 webinar folder. So I'll look at the desktop and I'll choose that folder. I'm going to place them in there. So here what has been done is we have now a list of 2 pins, our ceiling pin, which was purple or pink, I guess. We also have an image pin, which is this big camera rendering. And then we also have a background, which is our default HDRI from KeyShot 6. So what's really cool is now we have flexibility and we can edit this further. Now, the reason this is a little bit different than what you're used to perhaps is because we had to extract those pins and put them somewhere. When I open the folder that I extracted those pins to, you will see a few different images here. We have the custom HDRI.hdz. So that's the initial full HDRI that had the background plus the 2 pins. And then we have the image pin. So that's the camera, that green and yellow camera. And then we have the HDRI with the 1 in parentheses. This is going to be the background. So when I turn these 2 pins off, it's just a copy of this background. So the reason we get these different items here is because KeyShot has to pull out these images, and with that custom HDRI, the background was an image and the image pin was an image, and then the total combination of those was also an image as well. So we've essentially isolated and separated those out. If you want to keep working and making edits with these to this environment, then you'll want to be conscious of where those images are stored so they can be referenced. Otherwise, KeyShot won't know where to look for them. So if I were to say delete any of these and then relaunch KeyShot in the same file, KeyShot wouldn't know where to look for them, and it would not load these pins as is. Okay. I can actually show an example of that. So what I will actually do is go ahead and I will save this file first. So I'm going to save this as a KeyShot 7 file, and I'm going to go ahead and just do this on the desktop. Now if I go ahead and close this, and I go and delete any of those, let's say I just delete the image pin right there. That's the camera. Now if I go and open this KeyShot train file we were just in, it's not going to know where to look for that image pin that's missing. So if I go back into my environment, we'll see that it's just substituted a red pin in its place. So that's now missing. So I just want to emphasize the importance of, well, first off, I want to emphasize the power that we have in extracting pins using the new HDRI editor, but I also want to emphasize the importance of you keeping track of any image-based pins or backgrounds, because KeyShot will still need those if you want it to keep referencing those. Now, in the case of this HDRI, it's a little bit different because this one does not use any images. So I selected a different HDRI, which is just a studio environment. But if I go ahead and, sorry, this one was not built the same way as the other one that I showed you the example of in KeyShot 6. So in this case, this is just one single image. But any environments that you built in KeyShot 6 by manually adding pins to them, you'll be able to extract those and then work with those in KeyShot 7, which is pretty cool. So we also have, I'm going to turn this guy off. We also have the option to save out environments and export them. So a lot of people historically have asked about exporting their HDRIs, which was not something you could do. You could save out an HDZ, but in this case now you can save out or export HDRIs. So when you do this, you basically just name where you want it to go and what you want the file to be called. And I can say just put that on the desktop, and we will have a, in this case, this is an HDZ file. Let me see if I did that right. So that was export HDRI as an HDZ, which is the old style environment that you could work with in KeyShot 6. We can also go ahead and save this to our library if we needed to. So if I go ahead and had a new folder called My Environments, and I go ahead and save this there, we can see that it is now inside here. Let's see what else we have. The other thing that might have changed here is, or well, that definitely did change here, is our background styles. So the way this works is you have a list of your pins which live on top of your background, and then your background can always be changed to a different item. And if you're using anything but an image, so that includes sun and sky, gradient, or color, you can always, with one click, go ahead and increase the resolution of that environment or that background. And that's going to be good for tightening up your reflections and shadows, making sure they're not blurry or pixelated. Sometimes if you're using too small of an HDRI or an environment, you will be able to see that in your scene. So going and making something an 8K environment instead of just a 4K environment is always nice. And then you'll want to hit a generate full resolution HDRI in order to apply that. And what's cool here is you can always change out that background without having to rebuild your pins as well. Trying to think if we've got anything else here. If you do like the old style within KeyShot 6 where it launched a separate window, you're more than welcome to still use that. Just to show you how I got that, that's that little HDRI editor canvas button there. And
Will,
yes.
Real quick about the export. The reason why you exported in HDZ is because the background image is actually protected content. So as long as you're not referring to one of these protected HDZ files, yeah, there you go. You'll have the option to export as an HDR or EXR.
Perfect. Thank you. That was a bit of a, yeah, I missed that. Sorry. And that's a great point. So as long as, like Rex said, as long as that image that you're using as your background is not protected, as in this case it was, you are always able to export now an HDR, an EXR, or an HDZ environment to be used however you need. So if you're building your own custom environments using either a color or gradient, sun and sky, or an image of your own or something that you have rights to, then you can go ahead and make that export and then use that however you'd like in the future. So that's definitely a big upgrade too for KeyShot 7. We're getting a little bit closer to the end of the hour. I want to make sure I touch on Studios, and I think that we're at a good point to cover that. So Studios, as mentioned, is a slightly new way to work in KeyShot 7 when it comes to managing your overall scene. So if I go ahead, I'm going to actually delete the environment I had here, and I'll go ahead and place another one in my list. Then I'll activate that one. And so now I have two environments in my list I can toggle between. And I'm going to go ahead and look over here at my cameras. If we go over here, I've got just one camera. I can go ahead and add another one. Let's say I want to kind of an overhead view. I can add my camera and call it overhead. And so we have a couple cameras. The other thing that we can do is make a material variation. Let's say let's say instead of wood here, we're going to have plastic, or better yet, maybe I just want to change the color of the engine part here. So when I double click on this guy here that you see the orange outline around, the base of this, I get into its material properties. MultiMaterial is a button that you can click to get basically turn that material into a list of submaterials. And this one in this case is just a green paint. So if I want to make a variation on this green paint, I might click the duplicate material button and then go into the color and just change the hue. So now I've got a dark blue version. And of course I can go name it dark blue, and I could repeat the process. And let's say we want a orange version. It's maybe, we'll call it sand. So we have a few different versions, and then let's say we want a totally different type of material. I can go ahead and change this to, say, metal. Go ahead and do that, and I'll add some roughness. So here we have a few different materials that we can cycle through. And when we're going to look at studios, what we can do is go and click on the studio button, which if you're not familiar with that icon quite yet, it's going to be this little guy. So I can click on this, launch my studios, and this is going to be basically an evolution of using scene sets and view sets before. So what we can do with a studio is we can go ahead and create it. We have one in here already. I'm going to create a new studio. We'll just call this Studio 1 for now. And any of the items I want to include, I need to check the checkbox in order to make a selection. So in this case, I might want my overhead camera, and maybe I want my studio lighting. And we only have one model set right now, so we'll leave that as is. And if we want multi-materials to be an option, we can check that box, and we can select any of these multi-materials. Maybe for this one, the side view makes more sense, so we can see the different colors here better. But this is nice because now we've created a studio that's very flexible, that we can then use any of these drop-down menus to change any items out on it as needed. The one item that wasn't mentioned there was model sets, so we'll take a quick look at that. And I'm actually going to dock this, my studios. Let's see, I'll dock this guy somewhere over here. Doesn't want to dock over there. Okay. So if I go to my studio or my scene tree tab, to the left we see a separate item or an area called model sets. When I click on the add model set button, it gives us an option, and we can name it. So let's call this, we'll just call it model, or let's just call it frame. Let's say I want to show only some of this train. I'm going to turn off a few areas. So if I go ahead and let's say we want to turn off the dome, cabin, let's see, we'll keep those on. Let's see how this looks. So what we're basically doing is we're going to choose parts that we want to clone into the new model set. So after doing that, we now have a model set that's just the frame, and I can turn that off, and I can default back or toggle back to the default, which has the entire model, or I can go back to just the frame. And what's really cool is if I want to go ahead and move this, if I move this guy over and turn on the default, we now have both of them. So rather than only basically rather than duplicating your geometry between scene sets and everything like that, we can use model sets in a more intelligent fashion. When we go, if I were to go back to my studios, I can go ahead and, where we go? If we go back to my studios, we can now turn on our model sets, and we can say, oh, I only want to see the frame in this example. And of course, we can still switch through those multi-materials just as we could before. We could also create another studio and call it full train. And in this case, we can turn on the model set that is the default, not this one. And we can still do things like switch through multi-materials. So there's just lots of flexibility that you gain access to when it comes time to build out studios, to show different variations of products, different materials, colorways, things like that, different configurations. And of course, when you do go to render, what's really nice is in our render queue, you can add studios. And I can just add all of these to the to my render queue. This is also warning me that I didn't save my camera, so in this case I'm just going to reset it so it doesn't mess up anything. But now I have these different studios, and if I want to, I can then process that queue or send it to the network, whatever I need to do to render those out. So that's really nice. With just a few more minutes here, before Q&A, I wanted to at least touch on a couple properties of some of the new materials, which I think are very helpful. And if I double click, first and foremost, I'll hit Control G to add that ground plane I was talking about earlier. So if I zoom out and I select the ground, we can see we've got a piece of geometry there. And something that is really cool with this, if I double click on this material, and we look at, I guess I need to go into my environments, I can go into my settings and look at the ground, and we see that we have an option we can turn off ground shadows, and we can toggle occlusion ground shadows. And occlusion ground shadows are basically going to, it will create shading on the ground plane underneath your item instead of having the shadows potentially cast all the way off the edge of the page. And in this case, if I go ahead and turn off that ground plane, you'll see that it's actually not even needed for the occlusion shadows, which is really cool. So if I go in there, I can change everything from the shadow color, which will reduce how intense that is. I'm also going to throw us in product mode, so this looks a little bit more natural. So actually, yes. So within the environment tab, you have access to occlusion ground shadows now, which is an alternative method of casting a contact shadow without having it spill to the edge of the page, which is really nice. We also have ground reflections. If we go back, into the ground material that I showed you earlier, we have a reflection contrast slider, which is really nice too, because this will allow us to control how strong our ground reflections are. So I turned on specular, I made that white just so we had some ground reflections to begin with. And now with this reflection contrast slider, we can easily control how much and to what degree we are seeing reflected in the ground. And then if we want to add some realism, we can throw in some roughness. And again, this is just a lot easier than it used to be when it comes to controlling things like ground shadows and ground reflections. You now have independent control over those by using the new ground plane material, the new ground material, as well as the occlusion shadows, which live in the environment tab. Another option here, I have some metal applied to this. This is our new metal in KeyShot 7. So what I'm going to do is actually just close the multi-material option. So now that is no longer a multi-material. It is just a metal material. And just like before, when you're in color mode, you can go ahead and apply any color to that metal you like. So that's pretty cool, nice and basic. However, if you want to create something like an anodized aluminum, or really any element or type of metal, you can choose a base metal to begin with, and then you can go and check the anodized box, and you can make adjustments to the anodized finish that's applied to that metal. And now having control over things like film refractive index, film extinction coefficient, and film thickness, you can really dial this in to mimic or represent something that you have data for. So if you know some of the properties behind a product that you or your company is going to manufacture, you can dial those in, and the material will look a lot more accurate and realistic, which is always nice. And you can change the type of metal that you are working with to begin with, but all of this, again, is giving you more control and focusing on giving you the tools you need to create the finishes that you need to and the materials you need to in KeyShot 7. And if these sound complex, all you have to do is hover over them. And there are really great in-depth tooltips that talk about what result you will get by which action. So taking the guesswork out of figuring out how to use those, which is really nice. If I go ahead and adjust, let's see, if I go ahead and change this guy to a tune material, I wanted to mention, I will go ahead and delete these textures. So we're left with a very simple piece of, a very simple material. I just wanted to point out a few things that have changed in tune. If we open the advanced tab, we have all of our checkboxes down there. And generally up here we have a shadow color, and that is now texturable, which is really nice. Before it was not. We can also do things like, we can adjust our contour width and our outline width multiplier. And we've basically reordered these items a little bit just to make this material a little more friendly to use, a little faster to set up. And the default settings are generally going to work better out of the box. One other thing that's, or a couple others that are worth mentioning very, very briefly is our metallic paint. If we look at our library and I search for a paint and then I look in metallic, we'll notice we have a new group called Candy Coat, which is awesome. If I apply one of those, you'll see how much of a rich paint color you get from this material. And it even has some sort of orange peel kind of texture to it. So when we look at these, this material has a base color, it has a metal color, and it has metal roughness. But we also have a clear coat option, and we have the option to control the thickness of that clear coat, which will have a direct impact on how this looks. Of course, you can tint or put a color. You can control the texture or the color of those clear coat options. You've got basically a lot more flexibility than you once had with this material. And last but not least, of course, I will mention the cloudy plastic material. In fact, I'll grab one from our library and I apply that. And you will see that as this reses up, you'll see this is kind of a foggy or cloudy plastic, which can be used to great effect to mimic anything from a Tupperware, which is just a slight cloudiness to it, to a very kind of a milky, almost opaque material. Because this is such a thick part, what we are getting is a lot of cloudiness. So what I can do is I can do a number of things. I can either increase the transparency distance, which basically is the distance at which this color is achieved. And I can also reduce the cloudiness at the same time to reduce the amount of like scattering media that's inside this material that creates the light dispersion in there, or basically bounces the light around and makes it kind of foggy looking. There's a few other options in there in the advanced. If you really want to dial in the material, you can choose the direction of the scattering of light, which is really cool. But yeah, I mean, this is definitely a new material for KeyShot that requires a bit of exploring, but we will have some good documentation on that, as well as some future content that dives deep into how to set it up and how to use it. But that's a brief overview. I really just wanted to make sure you guys were aware of what you might run into if you open a KeyShot 6 file in KeyShot 7. So a quick recap, things like textures. whether it's on a label or a material, you may need to you will need to change it to the new style of texture mapping if you want to further edit that in KeyShot 7. Otherwise, it will remain in legacy mode and it will behave like it did in KeyShot 6. And we really want you to be able to take advantage of the new materials. They offer a lot more flexibility. Everything from customizing your own workspaces to customizing hotkeys, it's all there for you. We hope that you enjoy these features and the quality of life improvements as much as we do. Right now, I think since we're getting close to an hour time, I'd like to switch into Q&A mode so we can potentially answer some of your guys' questions, or I can touch on anything that I might have glossed over. But with that, Rex, do you have any questions that stand out or anything you'd like covered here?
Yeah, hey, thanks, Will. Yeah, there is a question about VR support, so like a VR headset. Can you quickly show how one might set up a VR camera, or a panoramic camera, as we call it?
Yeah, so the question has to do with how you would start by creating some content that can be experienced on a head-mounted display. And if I go and navigate over to my camera here, if I create a new camera and call this VR cam, I can go here down to the lens settings, and we notice that we are currently by default in perspective mode. We've always had orthographic and shift modes, but now we have a panoramic mode. And at this point, we can go ahead and we have two different modes. We have cube mapping and spherical mapping. And if we go ahead and preview, we can, oh, that's going to give us a little preview of what we're getting into. But I know that this is the beginning of it. Unless you have some specific suggestions, Rex, I have not personally created any content using this. So
yeah, probably better to view it in an interior type of scene.
Right, because at this point we're basically in the middle of the world looking outward.
Yeah, so the VR is most relevant for interiors and scenes like that. And there's basically two things we can do with VR headsets in KeyShot. We can, yeah, set up a cube map or a spherical map and view that in real time. So right here in the app, Will is not on a VR-ready machine, so he can't demonstrate that. But we could also just render out a spherical or a cube map image from any computer, and then just load that into your, Oculus or Vive photo viewer, and that way you get a fully rendered image, and that's probably going to give you the smoothest experience when working with head-mounted displays and KeyShot 7 content.
So you recommend rendering out your content first rather than just going straight to real time?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely depends on the type of scene you're working with and the performance level of your machine. If you do have a super fast machine and a simple scene, then it's definitely doable to view in real time. But keep in mind the resolution of a spherical image is very large compared to just a single still perspective image, because it does have to wrap all the way around. So it is going to take longer to res up a scene when you have the panoramic camera enabled. But what's cool is that as you move around this preview, as long as you're not actually moving your camera position and just mousing around, then it doesn't have to re-render. So you can let it sit for a little bit and then and look around.
Very cool. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Cool. Is there anything else that stands out?
There are a couple of questions about ZBrush. So we are working with Pixelogic right now on resolving some issues. So hopefully we'll have something available for the ZBrush bridge by the end of this week.
That sounds good.
Cool. I guess you can go ahead and wrap it up.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for attending today's webinar. As mentioned before, this will be available at youtube.com/KeyShot3D, hopefully sometime early next week if you would like to reference back to it. Also, take a moment to go on to our YouTube channel and check out the other video I referenced. If you're about to move a bunch of your KeyShot 6 or earlier library items out to KeyShot 7, you'll want to watch the video that Richard recorded there just a few days ago, and they will take you through each of these types of assets and how you would do it if you have not done what I suggested, which is just saving them in a custom location outside of the KeyShot directory. But those are my 2 recommendations, and until then, if you have any other questions, make sure you drop us a line or a question on any of our channels, or head on over to the KeyShot forum to learn more. Thank you very much, everybody.